Hello and welcome to this webinar on balancing love, work, and home in the age of pandemics. I look forward to having a quiet hour to zoom in and out a little bit on this Zoom call on the whole issue of what's happening at home during this very strange time. I just wanted to invite you all, if you wanted to put in any questions or reactions in the chat panel that you'll find if you hover on the buttons at the bottom of your screen. I'm very happy to jump back and forth and integrate some of your questions and comments. I'll make a couple of pauses during this presentation as well to take your questions if you have any. Or feedback. I'd be very interested to know what you're all experiencing personally. I thought for the purposes of this call that I would start by zooming out a little bit. And if I can get my first slide forward, that's great. And yep, go to the next one. The idea of couples themselves, I wanted to situate because they have changed so much. I'm going to zoom out a little bit in time to say, what are we talking about when we're talking about couples today and how dramatically they have evolved? And what we know now in the UK is that 70% of professional couples are in dual income couples, which means both are working. And while people, particularly young people, may find this as extremely normal, it's really quite new. It's not something that we have experienced before. And the consequences of having two couples working, you can even see it in the hierarchy in a lot of the companies that we work with, is the senior people leading the organizations are often in an older style of couple or situation at home, with the man leading and earning the majority of the income and the wife taking on the majority of the home and childcare. These old models have been shifted completely. And this new model of dual income couples that are suddenly locked up at home, the whole experience of this lockdown is going to bring this revolution and reveal it for the change that it has come, because it's affecting not only how women are experiencing this dual career issue, but for the first time also, just to what extent men are going to see it up close and very personal. So if I go forward a little bit and I really zoom out to some of the big changes I want to remind you of in history, if I could get the next slide, is that for much of the last, our human history together, for much of the last 2,000 years, men and women have had extraordinarily different roles. And this has really shifted. I always remind, especially younger generations and younger women, that what we're living today is still relatively new. And I usually summarize this by saying, our grandmothers, or my generation's grandmothers, got the vote back in 1918. Our mothers got the pill sometime in the 60s, and therefore were able to access good jobs and good educations pretty well for the first time on a massive scale. And our generation, and your generation, I think, is the first generation that's going to see true, sorry, can I go back one? Is going to see true dual career parenting, with the rise in legislation of of shared parental leave. But really what this lockdown is doing is accelerating the revelation of what shared parenting looks like as dual career couples are suddenly locked up inside at home with full-time jobs for some of you, different situations of who's working and who has priority. But what I'm hearing from a lot of the people I'm coaching online in this time is that they're really trying to allocate a certain amount of hours for each person in the couple to parent, and the other takes on a few hours a day of reserved work time. While this juggling may not be so new for a lot of women, even though it might be constricted, it's really having a huge impact on a lot of men in their understanding of the impact of parenting on your ability to focus and work, and this whole juggling act that's becoming so direct for them. So if I go on, this whole 20th century that saw all these shifts in the roles of women, what I keep suggesting is it's only in this century and then accelerated in this lockdown that we're going to see the impact of these shared and much more mixed up and gender neutral roles have an impact on countries, on companies, and at home on couples. And I think while a lot of us kind of know this in different parts of our experiences in different levels, I think what this lockdown is doing is bringing the impact of gender balance in companies and couples home to roost in a very, very different and much more visceral way. I also wanted to go into the way we often frame these conversations about work-life balance. And I've always found that's a kind of an artificial construct. It's not like our work and our lives are in opposition. That would be, for many of us who devote a lot of time and attention and care to work, a kind of old frame. If I could get the next slide, I prefer a picture that looks more like this, where you have a balance of work and family issues that are mutually supported by a couple that's the pivot on which all of that rests. And I think, again, what this lockdown is showing is that there is now, for some of you, a couple. For some of us, we'll be in single parent homes with, I hope, some form of a support network, but that there is a very important pivot on which everything else is resting and balancing. And we're trying to find what's the balance between these two pivots. But where it used to be, I think, a lot of women struggling with this, now we've got two couples, men and women, both trying to juggle what this means. And I think it's going to require a particular attention to the strength and management of that holding structure, which is the couple. How do you design and manage all the couple demands? And again, I think this whole situation of crisis is revealing whether that foundational pillar is strong and how it might be ameliorated and changed to support these new juggling acts. And what I wanted to point to is we haven't necessarily, yes, here's my little pivoting structure on the work-family balance, which is always one of movement and adjustment, sitting on this base of a hopefully strong couple. And what I wanted to talk about with couples is that I find that couples are very much in the same frame of mind about gender issues that a lot of managers and companies are, which is to say that it doesn't really matter. We're kind of post-gender, we're gender fluid. Gender doesn't have a real impact on our couples anymore. But I think that's not true. I think what couples could use just as much as companies is what I call moving from this gender doesn't matter, I'm gender blind, we're very balanced and neutral, to actually being much more familiar with what are the differences between genders and how do they play out at home? And are we at home and at work really gender bilingual? Do we understand what each gender needs? Do you understand what your partner needs? And if it's different from what you need, are you able to get both needs recognized in not only what the individual needs, but how that might actually be rooted in part in gender norms and gender research. Very traditionally, women have always picked up far more of the house care and the child care. And while that has evolved somewhat, there was nowhere near equality across the UK population in the roles and the gendered roles that we take on at home. While this is balancing out, and a lot of men have really stepped up over the last decade into much, much more care on the child care front, there's a lot of research to show that they haven't yet fully stepped up on the home care front. So what are the roles in the couple? Are they gendered? Do you have typical roles? Do you have agreed roles? And what might they be? And have they ever been explicit and explicitly discussed or negotiated? And if not, this is a challenging time to start doing that. But a lot of what we're finding about couples who are adapting to this incredibly difficult situation is how skilled they are at negotiation and contracting. Can they talk about who's doing what your needs are versus what their needs are, and how do you allocate the kind of time and attention to getting some kind of a win-win situation? So we're discovering probably very much in this time a very old truism that the most important career choice that any individual makes is who they partner with to accompany them on their career journeys. And while this is true for everyone, I have always said that it's even more true for women. And in this lockdown is, do you have your partner's support to help you manage your own career priorities and pressures, or not, is going to be revealed. I always kind of have noted rather sadly that women seem to only have two choices. If they're very ambitious and want a great career, I find that there are only two models that really work. One is the super supportive spouse that accompanies and is able to support very ambitious women in their trajectories. Or the sad reality is no spouse, which is a lot easier to manage. What I find is really harming, and maybe something that some of you are experiencing, is the kind of in-between situation where you have a semi-supportive spouse that may help you occasionally, but isn't always totally ready to sacrifice or even temper their own priorities in order to help you balance your own. And so I think being in part cognizant of, well, what kind of partner do you have, and what is, if anything, being revealed in this time of crisis? Are they the super supportive spouse? Are they the semi-supportive spouse, or are they of no support at all? Will probably have some consequences for future. And I wanted to also touch on what kind of career model do you have in your own partnership? And is this something that is, again, mindfully chosen, or something that's just evolved over time? And what we find today is that the kind of old standard traditional roles between genders was that you usually had the man, as I said in opening, being a single earner, lead career person, which is, again, what you find, what I'm seeing most of the executive teams that we work with, is you still have a dominance of that single earner or eventually lead career model. But everybody underneath and the entire generations coming up tend to be coming into a much greater variety of different kind of models. And it helps a little bit to know, what kind of model are you? So let me run through some of these. Are you alternators? That means that you kind of take turns on, okay, you have the big promotion to go to China. I will follow you and find something to do and adapt my career to yours, but the next career move will be my turn and I'll take the next lead. Very successful for some couples. Parallelograms are the kind of two fast track career, no sacrifices on either side, very hard to do, but if done successfully, these are kind of some of the super couples we see around the world. They usually have a phalanx of support systems around them that allow them to do all of this. They will be particularly challenged in this current time because of the support systems, usually resolving in some part to family support and paid support that is no longer going to have access. So how to keep those two fast track careers going in parallel is going to be an interesting and particularly tough one. Complements are when you have two very different kind of careers. So one might be the corporate career, one might be the entrepreneur, one might be the academic, one might be the scientist, but that these two different careers will have slightly different career cycles and time pressures that allow for some yield in certain times of crisis. So in a time of complements, for example, one of these partners may be able to devote a lot more time to some of the demands of the home than the other without it having a huge impact on their own career. Mergers are two people in a couple who decide to merge and start businesses together. We're seeing more and more of this in this generation. That has advantages and disadvantages in a time of crisis, is that you're in it together and you can balance home and take turns running the organization. It has some conflicts, obviously, because the home and work are so merged that it's very difficult to find any off time. And I think probably the most challenging of all is the sole player model, which is the single parent who is on their own at home trying to juggle both work and childcare in a situation that is very, very difficult to resolve. And there I'll talk a little bit about how to manage what you can actually expect of yourself or not. Maybe I'll just pause there and ask, how many of you see yourselves in any of these models, and which ones? And are there particular challenges in lockdown or particular advantages to any of these models of dual career? And if you just want to type into the chat. So can I please describe the complements couple again? Yes, complements are, the idea is two very different kinds of careers. So rather than having two people in a corporate, each in different companies, but in a corporate career that has very much the same sort of pressures and timelines over the year or over the week, complements are people in very different kinds of careers. So you might have one person who's a university professor and one person who's in a corporate career. So one person has a little bit more flexibility eventually in certain school vacations to take care of children, while the other will have um, different kind of pressures in over the course of the year. I hope that answers your question, Louisa. Um, so mergers, the challenge is to not get on his nerves or he on mine. Um, Absolutely, mergers, the challenge is you do everything together, right? You're in the same company and in the same family, so you're together 24/7. There's very little of the sort of psychic privacy that most humans need to survive. Um, and you're not even having a few hours a day, perhaps, on different issues. And that might be one of the things you need to do, is to make sure that you get a little bit of alone time, even if your issues are so similar. So from L'Oreal, you're the lead career. Um, I would think that that is eventually a little bit easier to manage in lockdown if your spouse is still okay to take on a lot of the home and child front. And as long as you can lock yourself up in a room or a space or a set of headphones that allows you to focus sufficiently on work to keep going, that is probably a bit of a competitive edge on at least on your ability to cope. My 5-year-old needs attention, Louisa, go for it. A typical, and here's Harriet, who's a solo player, and it's very challenging as my daughter does not understand why I'm working all day and resents me for it. I feel like I'm compromising on my work time already, and I'm frustrated that I cannot explain to her that I need to do my work. She is 11. So I think the whole issue of, I've been talking a lot here about negotiating and contracting with partners. I think part of the partners in a lot of families are children, and how to manage them. I think this is going to be a huge step up in terms of responsibility and accountability from partners, but I think it's also going to be a huge stepping up and learning journey for a lot of children who are going to realize that, yeah, their parents are not the 100% devoted humans that we show them in normal times, right? They're going to be a lot of new regulations, structures, and off-limit times. And my suggestion is a lot like on the issue of couples, is can you contract clearly with children? And you might have to do it in much smaller blocks. And you might have to negotiate with them and try and explain it in terms that they understand, and not beat yourself up for not being the kind of parent that they were used to. This is going to be a learning journey for children, and I don't think it's going to harm them. The fact that they're going to learn, especially if you're a single parent, that huge swaths of time are going to have to be dealt with on their own, is something I think children will and can learn. It's going to be a lot about the tone and calm with which you're able to explain this. Yes, I have to do a bit more childcare as no nursery, but fitting it in. So an interesting comment, right? Some of us are much better than others at managing the multiple demands on our time. I think a lot of us have learned how to juggle across our careers, and this is just a new juggle. And so how much can you do? How much time does your job take? It brings me a little bit to my next slide. which is uh, I really want to reassure all the parents out there who feel like they're not giving their children the time, that their children are suffering, um, that hang in there. Children are very resilient beings. They need love, but they don't need 100% of your time and attention. And I think I love this quote from Carl Jung: the greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of its parents. And I find a lot of working parents are always guilty at this balancing act where they feel like they're doing their child a disservice by focusing on work. I want to suggest to you that you're doing your child a service by showing them that you're devoted to work, that work is an important part of your life, and it's something you take seriously and you're going to invite them to take seriously as well. It's going to pay off over time. It's really hard to do in the moment, but I think the more you can anchor yourself in your own respect of your time and your priorities, the better able you are to kind of calmly explain to kids that this is really, really important. And they have things they think are important. You have your work time and you separate it out. And as long as they still get some, I hate that word, but quality time from you during the day, you will, I think, find that children are able to find reserves inside of themselves for creativity and innovation that usually gets unlocked after a period of boredom. And they have to get through the boredom wall to tap into some of their inner reserves. Um, so I just want to reassure, this is a weird, strange time. But the silver lining is it's going to teach kids about work. It's going to teach them about parents and what they do and how they manage the balance between work and family. And that doesn't mean necessarily prioritizing all the time your children. It's going to teach them where they sit and that they're only part of a whole system that's required for them to go ahead. What are my views on contracting with employers during this time? Absolutely. I think the discussion, the issue about contracting is that 80% of the value is the dialogue around contracting and being really clear on what are the expectations, what's being asked of your delivery, and what ability do you have to meet those requirements? And if you don't, being able to say so quite honestly. I think setting expectations in this time, every employer I'm talking to is doing some degree of this. And because a lot of the employers and managers themselves are in a similar situation to you, in that they themselves are locked down and juggling some of these issues, I think they'll be open to a calm, negotiated pact. I think the clarity you bring to it and the setting of your own boundaries will help at work as much as it does at home. So I want to work with my employer as much as possible, as I want my employer to succeed for one simple reason: I have a mortgage. Absolutely. And I think part of this negotiating with the employer, if you say that, I think that's incredibly reassuring. When you're managing up in organizations, when you're managing your manager, the fact that you're telling them that you share their goals and you let that be known and you say, I am trying to achieve your priorities, is worth saying. It's also worth saying to your partner, I hear you. I understand your priorities and I'm trying to meet them. Here's my ability to do it. Here's what I might struggle with. I think that kind of sharing is going to calm people's nerves. People are a little bit on edge as there's a lot of ambiguity and uncertainty. So somebody's sharing that their company, Verizon, has been terrific. The CEO and HR executive host daily company video podcasts to keep up to speed during this COVID time. Super helpful with setting clear expectations. And there's a COVID resource page. Would that all employers would be so good. And what I find very interesting is what you're pointing to is that the leaders, so the CEO and HR executive of companies, are really revealing the quality of leadership in this time by their sort of daily updates and being very clear. I would turn the tables and say, we can all step into a certain degree of that kind of exemplary leadership by sharing the same principles, being really transparent, talking truth, what you can do and what you can't, being very calm and open, and sharing the values that we all share, this vision. So that brings me a little bit to the next point that I wanted to get to is I wanted to point a little bit, because I know some of you may be feeling that this is a really tough time in a career trajectory. And so I'm going to suggest just some guidelines that I have found have come up in a lot of my coaching conversations. And the first is to pace yourself. Pace yourself in the current day. What can you get done? What can't you get done? What has to be done in the short term? And if you have relatively little time, if like many people, you're working on 4 hours a day and your partner's getting 4 hours a day of uninterrupted work time, be realistic about what you can actually get done and pace yourself over time. I'm also going to suggest in a minute that you pace yourself over a career lifetime. This is not a completely make or break time. This is a weird, exceptional, strange time. And life and careers are going to go on for decades. So positioning yourself in where you are and what you can get done realistically will be a really important one. Which brings me to my second part, which is something I think women suffer from, particularly in my experience, is perfectionism. We want to be perfect mothers, perfect spouses, perfect daughters, perfect colleagues, perfect employers, perfect leaders. Drop it. This is really not the time for perfectionism. This is much more the time for prioritization. What's important, and get rid of all the rest. If your kids' clothes are dirty, if you're not the perfect mom you've always been and want to be, or father, if you're not the perfect, that isn't what matters. What does matter is that you get the 3 things that absolutely have to be done today done. And that in those priorities, you've mapped the balance that you consider absolutely key. So that comes to point number 3 is know yourself. What is absolutely key to yourself? I think what's interesting in this crisis, I keep saying it's a time of revelation. I find leaders are revealing themselves, spouses are revealing themselves, children are revealing themselves. We see people's personality types show up. We see the introverts saying, this isn't so bad. I can concentrate much better than I could in my open space office. We see the extroverts climb the walls, leaning out of their balconies, desperately trying to talk to somebody, anybody. We see couples being very different in their reactions and their needs of what they need or really can't stand in this time. And so I'm just going to ask you, what have you learned about yourself? Does anybody want to share? What's been a real aha that you've had in this time? I'm an extreme extrovert, but I've been absolutely taken aback by how much I'm really enjoying being given permission to be locked up in a house and not move. Has anybody else had an unusual discovery of self in this time. And I add the word compassionately because I find it's not a time to judge yourself or criticize. We all have these really strong, and I think in times of crisis, even stronger, what's called inner voices, inner critics. Some people call them the gremlins, those little judgmental voices that are saying you're not doing enough or you're doing it badly. I think this is one real time to be gentle with yourself and know that probably you're doing more than enough. Let me read through some of these comments. I'm going to need my glasses on this one. I've realized I bounce off people. I typically give out a lot of energy, but also needed it back. Absolutely. So I really struggled at first. Not having the "I don't have the time" excuses brought me face to face with many of my old excuses. It's been enlightening. Somebody else, Jane, is used to working from home. Whoop, that went up above my screen. For 3 days a week, but I'm surprised how challenging I found working from home full time, losing those 2 days a week of connection. Absolutely. I've realized that we don't have to go out somewhere every weekend to be happy. I found that I'm not good at maintaining concentration on web calls. Yes, they're very difficult. I thank you, Harriet, for hanging in there with me. Now, though, I am being more present still and really enjoying this new normal, says Louisa. I think that's all really interesting discoveries because it'll be fascinating to see what and if it has any impact on the changes and decision management for work or family that goes forward. How many people will change the time they give, the relative time they give to work and family and other issues after this time? So I remind on the fourth suggestion is contracting with everyone, including yourself, really. And it's usually the contracting discussion that is of the greatest value. It doesn't matter what the outcome is. What matters is actually the process of contracting. So with work, with children, with partners, and I would argue first and most importantly with yourself. What do you really want to do? What do you really want to, what values do you want to absolutely uphold in this time? What are the things that are most important to you? What are the character, personality issues that you're going to struggle with that you might need help with? And can you go and ask for that help and find it? For the extroverts who really need connection, who are suddenly finding themselves overly isolated, how about contracting with friends? How about contracting? I, as my extroverted self, am finding I am having more and deeper conversations with more people than I've had in a long time. They're just online. I'm having dinner parties online to try and feed and nourish that extroversion side of what I'm not finding from work. And I'm finding, isn't it, it's kind of fascinating that online dinner parties with just 4 people brings out all kinds of depth and new things and takes away a whole bunch of the sort of social niceties. What'll I wear? What kind of bottle do I need to bring to this dinner party? And it brings a different atmosphere. So contracting with everybody is who needs what? And can you have a conversation that acknowledges their needs while also presenting your own, and then finding a win-win situation between the two of you or the two parties? And that includes children. I think if you can help teach your children a really collaborative form of contracting, what do they really need? When can they get it? Can they wait and do their own thing until you're ready to be able to do it with them? all that kind of a process is a huge part of the education and silver lining we're going to get out of these kinds of situations. So I wanted to end on sort of a career overview kind of moment. Is I really want to reassure some of us whose jobs might be on the line, whose careers are going through some ups and downs, who don't know what's going to be waiting for them on the other side. I have no idea if my business is going to tank or take off. We're all in a period of relative ambiguity. And I just wanted to remind you that careers are really long. And this is what I usually present as women's kind of archetypal career cycle. And I'll be very curious to hear if it resonates with some of you. And what I find is the 20s, when you're in your 20s, I mean here by age, it's a time of real ambition. We're seeing one of the most ambitious, educated, talented generation of women that the world has basically ever seen. I mean, this is a massive scale of 60% of university graduates are now women globally. And they're kind of coming out and running into companies that are welcoming them. Most companies are now extraordinarily gender balanced in this early age group. Then I find the more ambitious you are, the more you ram into this phase I often call the 30s, which is one of culture shock that some of you may have experienced, where you thought this whole issue of gender and everything was history. And then suddenly you realize you delay, typically the 30s, women are delaying marriage and childbirth. And then they do all of those things all at once in kind of quick succession. So get married, have a kid, have another kid, usually somewhere between 30 and 35 on average in Europe today. And the shock there is that it's not that easy to balance, that companies haven't adapted quite as much. Some companies are much better than others. Some companies have adapted for women, but not for men. So the whole issue of shared parental leave can be quite difficult in some companies. And this whole decade of the 30s, where that quick takeoff and, high performing women suddenly gets a little bit hits into if they can keep up the pace and keep advancing as fast as some of their male colleagues. And again, I just want to reassure you, if you're in that decade, that careers are not necessarily made or broken in this phase. What we're seeing is you can temper a bit. And I don't mean stop, but I mean, there are moments where you can plateau a bit, where you can park in a slightly less demanding job, where you don't have to take the next promotion, the next big mobility move, the next big thing. And that doesn't mean that you're parked forever in mommy track. I think those days are gone. What we are seeing is that you have a phase then of re-acceleration, of returning to work, of getting back into it. You can re-find your stride if you don't give up, if you keep learning and growing through your 30s. And that the 40s become a time where you can re-accelerate and re-find the kind of career interests, maybe in a totally different sphere than where you started, but that is very contributory. And what I find fascinating and we're beginning to see is actually a lot of women are finding that their peak career years, to their great surprise, is actually in their 50s and 60s. When the children are grown and often gone, is when suddenly they find themselves freed, often with spouses and partners who themselves are slowing down, and the women take off into much bigger roles. If you look at some of the senior women leaders around the world, the Christine Lagardes and the I can't remember all their names, who are in their 60s, even 70s, that we're seeing today. And so my question, if you're stressing out a little bit about, my God, my career is going to get really hit by this current crisis, and you're in your 20s or 30s, just remember that life is longer than you think. We're probably all going to live to be 100. And so the pacing of when you want to do what, and if family is a really important part, it's only going to last 15 or 20 years. And then you still have decades of contributory work and time still to do. So I want to just suggest that that is a completely different picture than the way a lot of companies manage careers, which might feel a little bit, if I could get the next slide, that the sort of traditional picture in a lot of companies is a sort of up or out, unbroken, linear male trajectory that ends very suddenly at retirement age. I think that is going to go a little bit the way of the dinosaurs, even though it might be alive and healthy in some of your sectors. If you're in professional service firms in particular, if you're in partnership structures, this tends to still be very real. But all the companies we're working for in that area are looking to flex it out, and not just for women, but for parents and for older people who no longer want to suddenly retire. So I'll end perhaps on, this is a time of huge shifts. We see that crises can yield complete shifts. And I've often talked about the 4 W's of the big changes that are happening in our lifetimes, and that every company that I'm working with is addressing: web, weather, world, and women. And they're all playing out in this pandemic. The technological shifts, the how good have countries been in using and harnessing technology to track the virus, to manage lockdowns and minimize them. The whole issue of weather, climate change, and sustainability as our cities clean up and the air we breathe above us has been unexpectedly lightened by this shutdown in economic activity. Will this accelerate or in any way disrupt the thinking about climate change? World is the whole issue of globalization, and the fact that, again, this pandemic has revealed that we are not alone and can't be hidden behind nationalistic, populistic arguments. We're deeply interconnected, and that a little virus that started in one country on the other side of the world has now swept us together in a common human enemy. And women, the rise of women in the 20th century has a huge number of impacts and consequences. And I'm going to leave you with that on my last slide. I wrote this very short blog over Easter weekend that I posted about how inspiring it has been to watch some of the female leadership in these different countries, how innovative, how fresh, how caring it's been. And this blog went completely viral and has something like 5 million views now. And it's that thirst that we're looking for new models, new voices, and that women are really offering the world a different way of connecting, a different way of leading. And I think you're all doing that. You're doing it at home, you're doing it at work. And I would say, be really proud of what you are managing to get done. It's probably more than you expected. It's probably more than your employers expected. And if you can acknowledge and share what you're learning from this experience and the good stuff that comes out of it, you'll be able to build on it to leapfrog in the future. I'll stop there, take comments or questions, and see if any of that resonates. If you want more reading, happy to supply some of my favorite authors and other resources on some of these issues. If you're particularly looking at couple issues, I would recommend everything by Terence Real. His name is R-E-A-L. Particularly if you're struggling with male partners who don't want to engage. He's particularly interesting on that. I'm sure many of you have heard of Esther Perel and her work. She's done a lot of work on couples in lockdown, and you can actually sit in and listen to her therapy sessions with couples that reveal some of the challenges and how to address them. And maybe the last resource is an INSEAD professor, Jennifer Petriglieri, not easy to mention, who's just published a book just before this crisis called Couples That Work. So if you'd like to input and start contracting inside of your own couple, sometimes it helps to share a book like that as a basis for discussion. So, comments, questions. How often do you think the contracting conversation is needed? I turn 40 next month. This model so far resonates. I'm hopeful I can make a difference in the next decade, and not just for myself, but for the younger generation at work, as well as role modeling for my young daughters. Well, when you turn 40, I think you're just about to start this kind of long upward acceleration that I speak about. So congratulations for getting there. And then I think the interesting conversation is, are there changes, and are you learning from this period what really matters to you and what you would like to devote your next decades to? And is it any different than what you have been working on and thinking about in the past? How often do I think the contracting conversation is needed? I think regularity is really important. Personally, I have a monthly structured sit-down talk with my own partner where we do what is called structured listening. So we always allocate one half day a month where we'll sit down, and structured listening means that we take turns. It's a pretty simple exercise. You may have done it at work. One of us will say everything we have to say for as long as it takes. It can be a 10-minute, it can be slightly longer sometimes, depending what's been going on. And then the other person has to listen without any commentary at all, no comments allowed, and then summarize what they heard emotionally, what they heard intellectually, and be able to, this is a really excellent exercise to do with your teams if you have them as well as your bosses, is this is what I heard. I'm reading that you're a little bit upset about this particular issue. I hear that this is all the issues you have on your list. And that ability, that skill of not only listening, but communicating to somebody that they have been heard is extraordinarily powerful in all of your contracting if you can inject the skill of listening and feedback immediately. And I would suggest the regularity of it helps people park some of the emotionality of daily life if they know that they can bring it to the table in a slightly more serene way at a given time that is predictable. So whether that for you would be weekly, monthly, or quarterly depends a little bit how much stuff is going on and what phase of maturity your relationship is, or how many issues you're actually dealing with. Thank you so much for this webinar. It was interesting and also made me feel more relaxed about what I can achieve and how to achieve it. Thank you. That's very much one of my goals, is that we don't feel under so much pressure right now to deliver. This is a time of certain incubation. And I think the more time you can save, if you have any, to observe yourself under pressure and to learn something about yourself. This is a really, really interesting, stressful time that should teach you something about yourself that you can harness for the next management of the phase. I also wanted to add, perhaps in conclusion, if anybody wants to go a little deeper or further, that I have reserved with a, a bunch of coaching friends and colleagues of mine, a series of free Friday coaching sessions. If anybody feels that they could use a little bit more of any of these themes, feel free to go onto my LinkedIn page and you'll find these half a dozen really stellar, senior, experienced global coaches giving up their time, not giving up their time, that's a bad formula, sharing their time with you for any of you who might be in need. Otherwise, I wish you a fantastic day. Thanks for your attention. Good luck in this crazy time. Stay safe, but stay alert. What are you learning?